Thanks. I'd agree with everything that Andrea said, but there's perhaps one thing I'd like to add, which is that although I think there was and has always been a great amount of bipartisanship in general, with respect to European integration, I think there have been clear partisan differences in the way that Australia is engaged with Europe or the European Union. And you mentioned some of the reasons for that. Conservative governments are more caught up by their rural constituents and so forth. Labor governments are traditionally much more internationalist, more into multilateralism, and there were very symbolic acts. When Whitlam came to power, the first thing he did was to sign a whole series of international conventions and so forth. And rather than do the same, when he came to power, he signed the Sugar Protocol in particular, which was really symbolic, and that really served to distance him from Howard. Had been such a sticking point under Howard. So with each change of government from coalition to Labor governments, there has been this back and forth between the anxiety and apathy of Menzies' government, and then to Whitlam, who was really enthusiastic and optimistic about what European integration meant. But then also, in terms of that jump, or that change, Whitlam, it was Menzies who had to deal with the negotiations as well, and he had reason to be anxious. By the time Whitlam came to power, much of it was a done deal. He didn't have to deal with the negotiations. Australia already diversified a lot of its trade as well, too, by that stage. But that pattern continues, so if I can just make a comment on sort of more recent governments too. So Fraser, as Andrea mentioned, he was very vocal and aggressive in Europe, and this was noted and commented on by the European observers back here at home. And there was this impression that also really affected Australia's relations with Europe. And then Hawke came in, and every time a Labor government came in, there was talk of a new era in Indo-Australian relations, and we heard that came with Bright and so forth. But so Hawke was again really optimistic about European integration. He saw it as a triumph of reason. I've got a quote here somewhere: triumph of reason over passion, of enlightened self-interest over self-defeating pursuit of the narrowest national interest. And he also saw the benefits of that kind of regional cooperation too. He was responsible for instigating the Cairns Group, for example, to be able to, he saw the benefits of really cooperating to really great power. Keating was the same. Keating, was similar. His focus was on Asia, but not necessarily the extensive Australia's relations with Europe. He saw the benefits of closer regional cooperation. And then with Howard, though, which Nina spoke about this morning, there was this shift back to, Howard was really suspicious of European integration. He'd been a special trade minister in the 1970s under the Fraser government, sent to Europe to try to negotiate the access conditions for Australia, and failed miserably. And that was certainly something that tempered his views of Europe when he came to power. He spoke about European Union being a bully, Australia being a victim, and he was quite vociferous about the inequities of the relationship and the effects of that on Australia. So there is this pattern of, there is a clear difference between the diplomatic styles of Labor and coalition governments. But the question is whether that made a difference on progress that was made. And I wouldn't necessarily, I would argue that it didn't necessarily make a difference on outcomes. And I think, Andrea, you've written about this, about the Fraser government anyway, and that you argue the same thing, but it didn't, Fraser had reason to be, that vocal and that aggressive in his engagement with Europe, but that it didn't necessarily affect, there wasn't necessarily a difference in the outcomes. So I guess that's the point.
Thank you. And now we move to the current period. I have a question for Yencken here. What impact that the Abbott government had on bilateral relations with the EU? What were likely to be its priorities? with regard to its relations with the EU, and what are likely to be the major irritants in the bilateral relationship between the African government and the EU?
I'm not sure if I should stand up as well because probably that or the room can't see me. So yeah, when I sort of told Pascalina I was going to talk about these things, in a way it was a slight mistake because we don't really know a lot about what's happened with the other government as to their approach towards relations with the EU. A lot of it is reading between the lines, but I think what I'm going to try and do briefly here is give you a brief outline of what we do know, and a lot of that is based upon statements that were made before that the other government was elected. So far, in terms of official meetings, there have been some meetings. Julie Bishop has met with Catherine Ashton, the High Representative for External Affairs, and not saying her full title, sorry. The EU ambassador has met with Julie Bishop as well, and with Tony Abbott, but essentially from what I can tell, they have mainly been very brief meetings. There have been no public statements. There was a result of those meetings, and no press conferences so far. So what we do know, as I said, is based on general foreign policy statements, particularly the more Jakarta, less Geneva statements, which Tony Abbott has made quite often about the new government's approach to foreign policy. But looking at what they are focusing on in terms of more specific issues, there's economic issues, this whole notion of economic diplomacy, and also security issues, but this has been focused quite significantly in the Asia-Pacific area, and Julie Bishop has stated that we're a global nation, but increasingly our focus will be on the region. For Australia's standing in the world is highest when its influence in our region is at its strongest. But I would think even with that sort of statements, you would think that maybe there would be some opportunities perhaps for Australia to acknowledge the EU's attempts or the EU's increasing presence in the region, maybe in one or two speeches, but that hasn't necessarily been the case yet. The EU and Australia do increasingly have a number of shared interests in the region, and particularly that's been seen by, if you're looking at specific instances of cooperation, the delegated aid agreement that's been signed between Australia and the EU, which is the first agreement of its kind that the EU has signed with a third country. So whether, particularly with the Abbott government saying that they're wanting to cut back aid in some areas, whether they would mention something like that as a way of more effectively delivering aid. But yeah, so just coming to the priorities, this focus on economic diplomacy, the negotiation of a free trade agreement with the EU is something that's been mentioned, but noticeably it hasn't really been mentioned after the Abbott government's been elected. It's more something that was mentioned before the election of the Abbott government. So and from my interviews as part of my research, there is a general sense that both EU and Australian officials have said that both EU and Australia are negotiating quite a number of bilateral FTAs at the moment, so whether or not there are enough resources available for both parties to negotiate a free trade agreement is something that's particularly written, that hasn't been, well, I would argue, acknowledged in recent articles or recent things that have been written about the potential of an agreement happening. There is perhaps the return of the common agricultural policy as an issue, as some of the past speakers have said. This has been perhaps more of a focus of a Liberal Party or coalition government, so whether that will happen, there's been no statements so far to suggest that there will be a return to maybe a more aggressive approach, but things could change. So, and as I said before, there has been limited acknowledgement perhaps of cooperation with potential opportunities of further cooperation with the EU in the region. So that's something that would be interesting to see what will happen in that area. Just coming to the irritants now, The most obvious one, or the most obvious difference between this government, the new government, and the past government was the statement from the very outset that there would be no linking of the ETS scheme, Australia's ETS emissions trading scheme, with that of the EU's. Obviously, the other government trying to get rid of the carbon tax or the carbon price. So yeah, that's simply not going to happen. There's a human rights issue, especially with the current negotiations with the framework agreement. This operative human rights clause that the EU likes to, or does include with all its agreements with third countries. This was an issue with the previous government, but based on the Howard government and its refusal to sign a similar clause in agreement with the EU in the 1990s, you could perhaps suspect that it's likely to become a problem again with the new government. As I said before, the Common Agricultural Policy, the Eurozone crisis, Tony Abbott was quite dismissive. He managed to sort of conflate the Labor Party's decision or desire to link the ETS scheme with the EU's handling of the Eurozone crisis, and saying, why would we want to essentially link our ETS scheme with the EU when it's been so successful in managing its own economy. So that's sort of paraphrasing. You can see, I think the quote's still out there from last year in a speech before the election. So yeah, the Eurozone crisis and public criticism of the EU's handling of the Eurozone crisis could still be an issue. The Asian Century, I mean, while this white paper, the Asian Century white paper, was published by the previous government, the current government is definitely focusing, or saying it's going to focus very heavily.
Yes, thanks. If you allow me to make a couple of comments, even if it's maybe a bit strange to talk about a visit that did not happen, but it's all. I think it's important not to over-speculate or extrapolate statements that are done pre-election, and to measure government rather by what it does than what proponents said when they wanted to be elected. And I think in the case of the EU-Australia relations, what we have seen as one of the first steps afterwards was actually Julie Bishop meeting Cathy Ashton in New York, one of the first leaders she met. And there they actually agreed that they meet again back here in Australia. Julie Bishop invited Cathy Ashton immediately afterwards. Cathy Ashton agreed, and the date was set for the 3rd of March. And all was in motion, and I spent most of my time early this year in preparing this, and say a little bit about what is actually there in the cards, because it's still out there. It was in the end cancelled because Catherine Ashton had to chair the meeting of the EU28 foreign ministers dealing with Ukraine. So this was something that came in between, but shouldn't be kind of read as a disengagement from either side. And this would have happened before the Auckland, which you referred to in London, this rather big meeting that regularly happens between the UK and Australia. Now, looking at the content and what actually was planned for the visit and is still out there, we're now currently looking at new dates, was actually quite a striking deepening of the relations. And I think we get back later into a bit more, but I just mentioned that there was the plan to sign an agreement on cooperation on crisis management. There was the plan to agree on deepening cooperation on counterterrorism. Delegated cooperation was on the agenda, also to mark the fact that the new government also stands by the agreement or stands by the idea that we can implement each other's aid money. So the statement that's already drafted but never saw the day of the light of the day was actually rather positive. Now, I don't want to kind of preempt things that haven't happened, but it's also just a lack of publicly available information shouldn't be overestimated at this stage after a trip has been postponed due to kind of overriding foreign policy reasons. I think I'll leave it there.
Well, while we're on the subject, I mean, my role here is to talk about a triangulation of relations between Australia, the EU, and the United Kingdom. And I would just think that its reading of the tea leaves is actually an important exercise to do. I take your point, Bruno, that of course, you know, things that don't happen can be given all sorts of significance over things that do happen, and of course, things that are planned cannot happen in the world of public diplomacy. But I think your point about the visit is right. Nothing in public diplomacy, you know, happens for not a reason. So it's quite pointed that she should go all that way and not go to Brussels. And to me, it suggests that there's something going on in the relationship which is very long-standing and very close. Remember that the UK's had a relationship with Australia for 200 and something years, 215, 16 years. Only Ireland can match that. And other EU countries, of course, have not been independent nations, you know, some as recently as 1991. So, first of all, there's that sense of depth of relationship and the personal connections. But something's happening in the United Kingdom, and I think specifically England, that is being reflected back here in Australia. And it's to do with the politics of the right, broadly speaking, and it's slightly different in Australia than it is in the United Kingdom. But let me just give you this quote. This is from Boris Johnson. I do like quoting Boris Johnson. You know, he's got a high profile. You know, he looks shambolic and yet is effective in only a way a member of the English upper class can be. Although I acknowledge his diverse background. But Boris Johnson said this recently. He spoke, this is December 1913, he's in Melbourne, he's writing this. He spoke of the historic and strategic decision that this country took in 1973, in which we betrayed our relationships with the Commonwealth countries such as Australia and New Zealand. And he went on, and he said, when Britain joined the common market, it was at a time when the establishment was defeatist, declinist and obsessed with the idea that we were being left out of the most powerful economic club in the world. Saying Andrea. In those days, he went on, when olive oil and garlic had barely appeared on the dining tables of Britain, it was assumed that in order to be internationalist, it was enough to be European. Well, it is perfectly obvious in 2013 that this is no longer enough, and that we need to seek what he called a wider destiny for our country. Now, what is interesting is that all that rhetoric about betrayal and decline is resurfacing now in Britain, right? But this is not a kind of a return to the 1970s. What this is a reworking of that past, the memory of that past, in light of global changes to the political economy of the world, right? So this idea that Australia is a global nation, but it is also an Asian nation, finds some resonance within the right of British politics, that Britain is a European nation, but it is also a global nation. And the stuff about global nation in Britain resonates at a much deeper level because it seems to be less of a break with the past. One way of understanding the role of Britain's past that Niall Ferguson, to give you an example, another historian on the right, has put forward, is that Britain's always a global nation, and that somehow the European part was an interregnum, a break from normality, if you like. And this understanding of the past has policy implications. So we talked about Julie Bishop's policy priorities, and rightly so. The ones coming back from London are different. They talk about 3 priorities as well, right? And this is an emphasis on emerging countries. No one said what they are, but they assume they know what they are. Traditional allies and the European Union. And notice that the European Union is not included in either of the first categories. It's not seen as a traditional ally. It's not seen as an emerging economy, right? So what's happening here is that these very profound divisions within the Conservative Party that the government has to manage, right? Leaving aside that the Liberal Democrats in coalition are also the most important, most pro-European parties. But even within the Conservative Party, there are very strong difficulties that party leadership has to manage. And one way that they're doing this is to kind of seek a disengagement from the EU. So when David Cameron in January 2013 was giving his speech on what he hoped a reformed EU would be, and also pledging that there would be, if the Conservatives were re-elected, an in-out referendum in Britain, you know, on whether Britain should actually just leave the EU. Only 2 days earlier, William Hague was in Sydney giving a speech about how Britain and Australia should cooperate more as bilateral global partners. In fact, encroaching on some areas of EU competency, if you like, about sharing diplomatic premises, about consular assistance and so on. But these two things do not happen innocently as well, and I think were it not for a kind of a delay in the delivery of David Cameron's speech, they would have been happening pretty much at the same time. And I think that that is significant, and I think that that is important to read these straws in the wind. And there was a debate yesterday or 2 days ago, London time, it's the last thing I'll say, between the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Nick Clegg, and the leader of something called the United Kingdom Independence Party, Nigel Farage. And this concept of the Anglosphere popped up twice, specifically. There were more references coming from the Eurosceptic party to Australia and New Zealand. And I think that that's significant because in Australia and in the United States, in other English-speaking parts of the world, there's a way of seeing the European Union that's seen to be as kind of vaguely socialist, outmoded, dangerously in hoc to green politics and environmentalism. And of course, the British view is very much it's about managing relations with the EU. But there's tacit support at the top, not from Julie Bishop, but from Tony Abbott, for this concept. And I think that it would be important to keep that in mind, because I don't think that, I mean, while I accept Nina's point earlier on today that Julie Bishop is running a foreign policy show, that could change, and I think there's a broader cultural politics which would be quite antipathetic towards the European Union in general. And if any of those irritants that you mentioned had come up, I think that that could start to become significant.
Thank you, Ben. I think my next questions are going to be for Philomena. They are about challenges and opportunities in Australia in relations. So, do Australia and the EU share normative interests? What do you think?
I'm going to probably move a little bit away from the UK, but I'm happy at another stage to talk about what I refer to as the burden of memory. I think that what's interesting between the European Union and Australia, particularly from around 2007-2008, is that you began to see a recognition of common normative perspectives. And indeed, in the preamble to the framework, partnership framework, which is the current agreement within which much of the relationship is based, there is a reference to shared values and close historical, political, economic and cultural ties, and to a shared commitment to the respect for and promotion of human rights, fundamental freedoms, democracy and the rule of law. So this all sounds so far so good, and in many ways it is good. There has been a common recognition of common views of society in many ways, views of being reliable partners who are committed to similar types of governance, to human rights, for instance. But I think where you see the difference about the perception of society and its norms is in two ways. And one is that the European Union is regarded as exporting those norms as a norms entrepreneur within its own region, but also within the Asia-Pacific region as well as in its own region. But the second aspect is the European Union as the most important regulatory normative power in the world. And this has been, for instance, commented on and noted by the US State Department over many years. So this is where the European Union is, in a sense, the trade regulatory power and the recognition of something that Katrina talked about, the idea that the European Union is actually a bloc or a region of 28 member states which have a common trade policy. And so here we're looking at not only in its trade policy, but also in its regulatory standards, that it is the standard par excellence, the template for other parts of the world. This is where there's a divergence here in Australia, and having spoken with many excellent Australian negotiators within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, TFAT and elsewhere, as there is a tension there about how much you regulate your society. And one former Australian ambassador said to me, what I find really interesting about the European Union is that it deregulates. I can understand that. You've got a market there of 28 member states. It then regulates, okay, so you've got to regulate on norms, mechanisms, etc. But he said what really annoys me is when it pre-regulates. just in case. The just in case concept, which is regarded as very French or Italian or whatever. There's this idea that just in case you're thinking of doing it, don't do it. They say in Italy you need to have active knowledge of 70,000 pieces of legislation just to know what you shouldn't be doing. And this is often used as the sort of example about the European Union as well. So here's where I have seen and observed just in comments and indeed more than comments, statements by the Australian policy-making community that there is this divergence. But I think that we can't overestimate it. We need to recognise that sense of commonality and societal values. And we see this particularly in the concept of shared values within the region, because the relationship between Australia and the European Union is bilateral in terms of the sort of negotiations and agreements already signed, such as those Bruno has spoken about, the civilian crisis management on something like the wine agreement in the past, the fact that Australia was the first country to sign a mutual recognition agreement on standards and other aspects relating to trade, all of the countries in the world. So you have many, many agreements that are taking place. What is not there at the moment is a sense of a reciprocal respect and a sense of common interest based on trust. Over the last, I suppose over the last 8 or 9 months or so, that is made evident. And this is where the difference between diplomacy and public diplomacy comes to the fore. So I take Bruno's point that these agreements are just about ready to be signed, not the framework agreement, but the other ones that you mentioned. But I also think the point has to be made that public diplomacy has to be public. And here I think on both sides you are not seeing this. And the second aspect is we've got a very realist government here at the moment. The two things that realist governments always talk about is trade and security. And this is where we are likely to see agreements taking place as well between Australia and the European Union, rather than on normative issues. So while there are still some normative standards, and even the emissions trading scheme issue is still on the DPAT website, I checked last night, and the issue of common mutual interest is still on the DPAT website. Nevertheless, you will see this starker and narrower view, which is based more on bilateralism than on a regional and interregional perspective, or on a multilateral one. I'm happy to go back to those, but I just thought I'd throw these comments out for starters. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's some more questions for you, Philomena. To what extent do they have common threat perceptions in their region?
Yeah, I came up with that question. I thought that was a terrific question. The problem is I actually haven't sat down and answered it. Yes, but I think the issue is there is definitely a security, a traditional security or hard security and non-traditional security set of threat perceptions within the Asia-Pacific region. They are shared perceptions, quite often referring also to two hegemons within the Asia-Pacific region. One is China, and the second is the external hegemon of the United States. And so here we get some complicated relationships taking place because of the concern about China, which is expressed in two different ways by the European Union and by Australia, because Australia has recently, for instance, closely aligned itself with the United States regarding South China Sea, for instance, whereas the European Union again returns to its normative regulatory stance of saying, let's look at the international law of the sea, for instance, let's look at international agreements, the statements that are repeatedly been made by Catherine Ashton. So here we see that there's the sense of threat perception changes, even though there's some aspects in common when you look at the role of China. The second aspect is the role of the United States. That's why the United States has signed an agreement in July 2012, the Hillary Clinton-Catherine Ashton agreement on common interests within the Asia-Pacific. Nevertheless, the European Union also has the possibility to work with other interlocutors such as Australia. And here there's an opportunity within the Asia-Europe Forum for what's often known as minilateralism or issue-based leadership to actually take a number of issues and to drive them together. So the bilateral EU-Australia relationship can actually also be driven through the Asia-Pacific issue. So we've got issues like of hard security concerns, North Korea, the South China Sea, but there are also the areas where Australia and the European Union can really work and where I think they can come into their own and where indeed the EU has a considerable amount of credibility. And here I'm talking about crisis management. Here I'm talking about the statement that came out overnight on Mindanao, for instance, from Catherine Catherine Ashton. So you've got, and following up from ACHE, the ACHE monitoring mission, where the European Union can become involved in interregional relations with, for instance, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to work on behind the scenes on peace mediation, civilian crisis management, and then leading in some cases like ACHE peace monitoring. So, and this is something that, as in the ACHE case, was supported very strongly by the Australian government. Also issues relating to peace promotion, but also in terms of people movement, increased EU engagement with the Bali process, which I think is a flawed process, by the way, but nevertheless has some potential. The EU is already engaged in the exchange of police and other information with the Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation, based in Jakarta, set up jointly by Australia and Indonesia in the aftermath of the Bali bombings. And here the European Union has been a major contributor to it. So you can see these sort of regional contexts. The last two I'd like to mention in the context of non-security as well as non-traditional as well as traditional security are the ASEAN Regional Forum, where Australia is a participant, but so also is the European Union. And here again there's a considerable amount of cooperation taking place. The last one is the East Asia Summit. And the East Asia Summit is where the United States participates, Russia participates. The European Union is not a member and is really extremely keen to be a member. The reasons for these are quite complex. The reasons for Australia, the EU wanting to be in it are complex. There have been discussions between Australia and the European Union on this issue, but there are considerable opportunities to deepen relationships because of some common threat perceptions relating to people movement, relating to refugee issues, relating to non-traditional security issues such as food security, with which where you see Australia and the European Union working with ASEAN. So I'll stop here, but I think that is quite a nice big fat menu for potential cooperation, regardless of who happens to be the Prime Minister.
Okay, so my next question is for Bruno.